Alright. Would you please consult the graphs? Basically, what you're looking at is kind of my own assessment of postmodernism. A lot of this is going to be built off of not the work that I've read, because to be honest, I literally have not read any postmodern literature. The only book that I can say has inspired this video, especially the second half of this video, is the book Otaku Database Animals by Hiroki Izuma. If you consult the graphs, dude, it's basically how narratives have changed over time and how our media gets consumed. And I think that in the West, in particular, this has an interesting effect, especially in politics. So to just get some of the jargon out of the way, what I'd first like to talk about is arborescent and rhizomatic systems. An arborescent system is a system that is structured like a tree, okay? So just, if you need help with that, go outside. A rhizome is more so structured like a network. It's kind of like the internet, right? Where you have a website that links to another website that links to another website. There isn't really any sort of value that structures them or places more importance on top of another one. It's just all kind of existing in the same space. So to signify this, I have basically this right here. Square equals 3 squares. A square is an arborescent structure, whereas a circle is a rhizomatic structure. Now, I want you to interpret this sort of starting from here in a clockwise manner. It'll make more sense if you do it that way. This is sort of the transition from a grand narrative to a simulated reality, which will make more sense later. So to begin, we have pure arborescence, which is locally arborescent and is also globally arborescent. The constituents of the tree, of the entire narrative, are microcosms of the grand narrative. So yeah, dude, an example of this is a fucking family tree, basically, okay? A family tree! I have sex with a person and I have a baby, and that's a microcosm of how I was born and how my parents were born and how their parents were born, and so on and so forth, until you get to some supposed monad, some inherent thing. Who knows? Maybe it's God. Maybe it's God. Moving on, we have rhizomatic arborescence. This is a system that is locally rhizomatic and globally arborescent. So the constituents of the entire system are composed of networks of associations, but is otherwise, on a global scale, structured still hierarchically. An example of this is fragmented discourse that is still pointing towards a totalizing narrative. Okay, so an example is, you know, this guy might be a left. This might be the left. This might be the right. And then these are the different offshoots. This is like a communist left, and this is like a, I don't know, you could say maybe authoritarian left, liberal left versus authoritarian right, liberal right. But generally they fall under the category of right versus left, which falls under the totalizing category of political ideology. Moving on, we have arborescent rhizome. This is a locally arborescent system, but globally rhizomatic. The constituents of this system is comprised of elements that are organized hierarchically, but is, on a global scale, organized rhizomatically. An example of this is kind of similar to this, in that these could all represent hierarchies of ideologies, like religions or something like that, but they all exist kind of on the same space. They're not valued. Like, I guess, like, this could be an example of like New Age spiritualism, where it kind of takes from all of these very rigid frameworks that already exist and combine them into one universal framework. And then we move on to pure postmodernism, the pure rhizome. It is locally rhizomatic and also globally rhizomatic. An example of this could be like Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is a purely rhizomatic system of articles On Wikipedia, you have articles that refer to other articles that refer to other articles, but there's no overarching hierarchy that structures them. The benefit of this is that it doesn't really start anywhere and it doesn't really end anywhere. You can start on one page and end up on a completely unrelated page. You know, there's this famous game, Wikipedia game, where you start on a random Wikipedia article and you try to get to Hitler, and you see how many clicks it takes to get to Hitler. But there is an inherent flaw to the system. You see, the problem is that if the constituent parts are still made up of other parts, and you can divide that infinitely, then there's still in space some sense of scale. So it still kind of implies hierarchy, as you can see up here. This is the problem. This is the problem. That leads into my next point. Database consumption. See, the whole idea of the postmodern condition is that grand narratives are at least not really valued very much, but at worst tend to just completely collapse. They collapse. Nietzsche and the Death of God, that's an example of a grand narrative collapsing as a result of modern empiricism and technological innovation. It also applies for just any narrative, any story. So I want you to imagine that you have a whole world full of grand narratives. You have all of these narratives. You have the narrative of the American dream, and all of the media that is produced in America is a microcosm of, you know, the values that are proposed by this idea called the American dream. But when that dream is no longer feasible because the people in power have fucked everything up, I want you to visualize this as the grand narrative literally collapsing into a one-dimensional spectrum of surface elements. So the idea here is that you have grand narratives that are made up of small narratives, and you have the things that are at the precipice of the narrative, which is the things that you perceive immediately. So for example, as opposed to the grand narrative of a given story and all of the small narratives that happen in between the beginning and the end, you have just the characters, the lighting, the signs and symbols that exist to construct that world. And so this is what Hiroki Azuma is positing in his theory of database consumption. Because Azuma is talking about otaku culture, it's going to be much easier for me to just kind of repeat the examples he uses. If grand narratives collapse, all that's left is small narratives. And this is narrative consumption. I think he references a guy named Ito Go for this, but I might be wrong. I don't remember. For narrative consumption, right, you no longer have a grand narrative, okay? The point of the narrative is to create products that can then be consumed to emulate the meaning of a grand narrative. So for instance, Pokemon, okay? Pokemon! You know, the reason for Pokemon existing as an anime isn't necessarily because it's awesome. We need to have this Pokemon media. We need kids. It's a cool, quirky TV show, and we're going to make lots of money off of it. No, lots of shows like that actually didn't make any money. The reason why it exists is because it legitimizes the product, which is like Pokemon cards, games, figurines. These are things that can actually be consumed, right? And you can consume them without actually consuming the narrative. The narrative no longer takes precedence over the surface elements. The surface elements are legitimized by the small narratives. And after another generation of developments, the small narratives collapse. So you get now grand non-narrative. You know, it's like G.I. Joe, right? I remember the figures. I didn't even know that shit had a show. Low-key. I never watched no G.I. Joe. But what happens when narratives collapse into the same dimension as the surface elements, what you're left with, the purpose of media, becomes affect. Right, so there is no substance that is meant for you to reflect on. There is no substance that is really, that serves the purpose of informing you or giving you a sort of theme that can enlighten you in life. There is no transcendental function It is purely meant for that good old consumption. When you have the cute, quirky, kawaii waifu, okay, Rei Ayanami, my 14-year-old, wait, pause, cutesy Lucky Star character doing some quirky shit on the screen, that character does not exist to inform you about a worldview, okay? It doesn't exist to help the narrative. It doesn't exist to affect the environment that it inhabits. The only purpose for that character is to give the person viewing the character a sense of moe, right? A sense of affection towards the object. So there is no subjective relation to the media anymore, right? It is purely affecting you on a pre-conscious level, the most immediate sensory input that you could get, and the immediate effect of it. The identity of the subject is unstable in relation to the object because the object serves no purpose for the subject other than the most basic pre-conscious feelings and intuitions about the immediate character, the feeling, the affect. So when this consumer market continues onwards, eventually it becomes aware of the fact that the characters are giving this sense, right? Giving this feeling of moe, giving this impression, this immediate pre-conscious impression onto the viewer, and that the viewer is actually beginning to value that over the narratives. And so what does a sensible person who is producing things for a consumer market do? They analyze the products that the consumers are consuming, deconstruct it into all of the parts that give them the feeling that they're valuing, and reconstruct the new product. And when producers do this, what they're effectively doing is creating a database. They're aggregating all of the surface elements into a database where they can input all of these things that would give a viewer moe. They input it, and then they can output a new rearrangement of those elements to produce simulacra. We are in a simulated society because we have no narratives. There is nothing tying us subjectively to the world. We are just viewing things that are reconstructions of deconstructed elements that have been broken down so many times over time that there really isn't anything that you're copying these reconstructions from, but they're also not original. The database replaces the grand narrative. So what can we get from this, right? A similar example would be Sonic OCs, okay? The Sonic universe provides the substrate for the derivative works from fans to create their awesome DeviantArt Sonic OC. And these Sonic OCs are valued just as much, sometimes maybe even more, than the original works. They're consumed equally. Another example is like US politics, okay? A politician no longer embodies the values of a grand narrative, okay? They have a database of slogans and things that they could say and policies that they could support that is in line with their party, and they can deconstruct that and reconstruct that into new organizations to produce a public persona that is like the conservative icon but doesn't actually embody any of those values. You know who I'm fucking talking about here. Come on. I would even go as far to say that online political identities can function as simulacra, and this is because to have an online political identity, you don't have to have any of the real embodied values. You don't have to act in any particular way. You don't even have to fucking vote. If I'm trying to appeal to, say, a left-leaning agenda or whatever, all I have to do is sort of pull from my left-leaning database that I have accumulated from consuming online left-leaning political media, pull from that database to reconstruct a online political identity by repeating similar arguments or similar slogans or similar, saying I support a particular political movement. I don't know. I've never actually read Deleuze and Guattari, so I'm making all of this up.